Okay, so Azure Container Apps. I'll pause for a question. Sunbar says, is event-driven framework a requirement or a prerequisite for microservices? No. Again, a microservice is just an autonomous, independent process or application that's running out there, and it could sit there and it could host a number of web services. You could split up a website into independent, you can call it microsite versus microservice, whatever terms you want to use. One pattern that I really love is recognizing, is sprouting an admin site off of an application. When you realize that you're starting to implement role-based security somewhere, look at it, and it may be a simpler solution to instead realize that, you know what, there's 3 particular screens that most users should not have access to, and only the quote super admins should have access to these particular 3 screens. Therefore, we need to implement user roles, and therefore we need to have this basic permission, and therefore our navigation system has to have the intelligence of that solution. So, and we need to block normal users from going to these 3 screens. Well, that's a lot of complexity to put in there. Okay, so anytime you're going to add a piece of complexity, it needs to have a return on that investment. Well, sometimes it is a simpler solution to say, all right, let me take those 3 screens, let me create web application number 2. All right, whether it's MVC, JavaScript SPA on top of web services, or the what I would consider the new normal .NET application, Blazor WebAssembly. Create a second web application for those 3 screens, and you can't even log into that second application unless you are a super admin. And so right off the bat, no more role-based security, no more permissions. You have now a second application for the admin site, and it logs in, but it only even authenticates if the user has a tag of super admin, some column in your user table or a particular claim in your identity server, whatever it happens to be. And so that second web application with 3 screens, guess what? It's a microservice, right? It's an autonomous, independent application with its own Git repository. Now, if you don't want to quite make it autonomous, don't want to make it a microservice, you don't necessarily have to. You could leave it in the same Visual Studio solution, not make it totally autonomous and independent, but just at runtime independently deployed. And therefore, you still have one integration build, one DevOps pipeline, and that's a fine solution as well. So don't feel bad if you don't understand all the hype about microservices, because microservices is not the new normal for the majority of teams out there. It is another tool in the tool belt, and you will know when to reach for that tool when the other solutions don't seem to fit, because it comes with some of its overhead. You have to have a new Git repository, a new automated DevOps pipeline, which includes new deployment. And so now you have 2 applications that you're managing and operating that flow on independent schedules. So it's a real important decision, okay? And when you need it, and the pattern's there, and it's great, and it's awesome. But if you don't need it, well, then it's just kind of overhead that slows you down and doesn't actually provide any value, all right? You get the return on investment when you're already moving slow because you haven't implemented that kind of pattern, and implementing actually speeds you up because it took out some new possibilities. All right, so thanks for that question. Another question from Nicholas. Were you the guy who said to put each of those environments in separate repos? Were you the guy? Well, I'm not sure about that. There's a lot of guys out there. Environments in separate. Well, you put code in separate Git repositories if that's what you're talking about. So if you want something to be autonomous and independent, the full spirit of the genesis of the microservices pattern, then yes, you would put that code in a separate Git repository, and then therefore you'd have a separate build and DevOps pipeline. I hope that answers that question. All right. Let me do a little bit of demo, and then I'm going to come back. There's a few more questions. Okay. So when it comes to Kubernetes, when you look at Kubernetes documentation, you're going to see a few things. You're going to see the Kubernetes, the overall cluster. You're going to see Kubernetes worker nodes, and then you're going to see pods. Okay. Just remember that a container app wraps a Kubernetes pod and is the unit of scaling and network segmentation. So everything running in a container app, which by the way, you can have many Docker containers. Therefore, you can have many .NET applications running as each in their own container in a single container app, just as you can have many web applications running inside of a single Azure app service. Okay. But an Azure app service has an Azure app service can actually have multiple URLs, one for each web application. A container app has a single URL, which I'll show you. And so you need to manage your ports because you don't want containers stepping over each other. But a container app is a Kubernetes pod, and it all scales together. And then a Azure Container App environment is the virtual network boundary, whereas the container app has a known IP address. So just that's the kind of correlation to Kubernetes. All right, so I'm gonna just finish this and get into a demo here so that you can kind of see firsthand. Going to move over to Visual Studio and Azure, Dapper. If you've heard of Dapper, I'm not going to talk about Dapper today. If you've heard of Dapper, it literally is embedded in container apps, and it abstracts away ports and networks so that if you need to call a web service on another one of your applications that's in the container app, then you kind of have a synchronous service bus or network locator where you can call it, and Dapper does the translation. It's almost like Dapper is DNS for your applications. Dapper is the registry where you can call a service based on its name, and Dapper knows where it is because you got all these containers running around. All right, but we're not going to talk about Dapper today, but just to kind of whet your appetite. And on the costs, okay? So a CPU costs what it costs, but you can basically run a full CPU's worth of load for about 1/3 of a month before you start paying anything. So for testing and doing development, you got a pretty nice grant on the free side. And so you get free CPUs, you get free memory, and then you also get free HTTP requests. So you get 2 million. That basically, if you were to do 3 web requests every second for an entire month, that would be 2 million. If every working hour of 5 days a week, you could be running 3 requests every single second while you were at work for an entire month, and that would be your 2 million of the free grant. And then above that, you get charged per request for the memory I've allocated, and for the virtual CPUs you get allocated. So again, the pricing is based on CPU and memory. So it's going to be comparable to having the same capacity of app service running all the time, but container apps are meant to scale and be elastic. So you have a much better chance of only paying for what you need. Whereas with app service, we tend to over allocate and leave it allocated even when the capacity isn't needed every minute of every hour.